Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us for this segment, we have Mario Cordero. He's the executive director of the Port of Long Beach, and we're going to discuss supply chains and just exactly what takes place in the ports that help to transport all of our global trade. Mario, it's great to have you with us at MarketSite. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Thank you, Jill.
And Mario, it's so interesting. The average consumer, we did not think about port activity until the pandemic came along and we understood just how connected they are to supply chains. Explain to us the Port of Long Beach, what goes on there, what kind of goods go through, just how big is that operation?
Well, the Port of Long Beach is the second largest container port. And in fact, the San Pedro Bay complex that includes Puerto Vallarta is the largest complex in the United States. So significant volume comes from our most important trade region, Asia. And
what are the imports that come through there?
Well, quite a few. I mean, when you talk about apparel, footwear, whether it's consumer goods, and then durable goods, appliances, electronics, and go down the list, furniture. So I think what this pandemic really surfaced is Americans begin to realize how important the port authorities are with regard to everything that they basically purchase. And as part of the globalized world that we live in. So significant volume and significant commodities come through the Port of Long Beach.
So cargo that's destined or comes through the Port of Long Beach, where does that go in the United States? Does it go to just the West Coast, or does it go all over?
Well, the San Pedro Bay complex, as we call it, it goes to all regions in the United States. Mm-hmm. Now, having said that, there's other gateways that are options for shippers, but primarily and historically, the most significant gateway, we send cargo to Chicago, Kansas City, as far as Memphis, Atlanta. So there's several regions, and of course, most of that goes by way of rail when we talk about the inland cargo that moves forward. And the regional is mainly by truck.
What were some of the challenges that the port realized during the pandemic?
Well, fortunately, one of the challenges that we did not have was the men and women who worked on the dock. They worked day in, day out. Mm-hmm. As to the challenges that we had was the surge that occurred following the negative volume in the spring of 2020. As we explained the supply chain, it starts in China, it starts in Asia. When there's lockdowns there, it's a domino effect. When they reopen, it's just a surge of volume. And the other interesting fact that I think we all realize is the emergence of e-commerce at the level of a 30% growth in 2020, another 15% growth in 2021. So needless to say, during this time of COVID crisis, Americans have and continue to have a pretty healthy appetite with regard to consumer goods.
Has the supply chain bottleneck largely been worked through?
In the West Coast and Southern California, yes. Mm-hmm. And I say that because the basic metric people were looking at earlier this year, 109 vessels backed up waiting to get into either the Port of Long Beach or Los Angeles. That number now is 10. So we're far better than other container gateways in the country.
If something's coming from China, by the time it gets to my door, what does that workflow look like? How long does that take?
Well, in normal times, you talk about a 14-day travel from China to the West Coast. Then let's say an additional 11 days for that container to go to Chicago, to the Midwest. So those are the normal days. Obviously, during this pandemic, during this global supply chain crisis, those numbers were significantly more. But the good news is, again, we're starting to have more fluidity, the movement of cargo, and I think right now, especially with the resolution of the potential rail strike, I think that gave a lot of comfort that we're on the road to some normalization of the supply chain. So I think, to your question, we have vast improvement in terms of how that supply chain is functioning.
Right. Well, the silver lining to the pandemic is lessons have been learned. And I understand that you're investing $2.6 billion in strategic projects over the next 10 years. What will those projects allow the port to do?
Primarily, our investment is going to rail. In other words, we talk about how large the vessels are in today's world. 60. In fact, Port of Long Beach served two 24,000 TEU vessels, MSC, during this pandemic. But the trains are getting longer. 8,000-foot trains are now 10,000-foot, and it's not unusual to see a 16,000-foot train in terms of length. So we're putting our money in rail, and we're building now, starting the state-of-the-art rail staging area at the Port of Long Beach. It is a $1.5 billion investment, but that's in addition to what we've already done in the last 10 years of almost $4 billion in investment towards infrastructure. So we are very well positioned, but the question now for this crisis in terms of lessons learned, what happens outside the harbor district in the supply chain? And,
Right.
and thus, I've been a big advocate of 24/7 operations. In other words, have a framework to expand hours of operations. That's the next challenge that we need to move on.
Could it be alleviated if some of the supply chain or manufacturing was done more locally, or do you think we're still really going to be reliant on Asian manufacturing?
I think we're going to be relying on outsourcing. I mean, but there is going to be part of that's going to what we call near sourcing. You know, whether that comes to Mexico, Latin America, essentially in the Western Hemisphere. I think you're going to see that. It's going to take time for that transition to occur in any numbers. I don't believe that we're going to go back to the days when I was a kid where everything was manufactured in the USA. You know?
Right.
But there'll be some component of that. Obviously, in terms of medical supplies, PPE, that's a lesson learned. I think that's going to be a domestic production, and we're seeing semiconductors, a domestic production. But I don't think it's going to be at the height that you're going to have a total transformation of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, cost, of course, is going to be a factor, so I'm
Absolutely.
sure that's the leading factor. Do you expect that we're going to see more volume moving forward? It's just only going to continue to grow as more Americans adopt e-commerce?
Well, the forecast before the pandemic was we were going to see more volume at the nation's largest port gateway. We are seeing that. Now, in terms of the surge that we've experienced here, particularly in the last year, I think that's going to dissipate. The consumer demand, retail sales are starting to, you're seeing a softening of that.
Right.
But again, keep in mind we had a very hot economy and we had a very robust consumer demand in the last year and a half. So even with that, for the first 8 months here in 2022, we've exceeded our volume at the Port of Long Beach by 4.6%. But we are expecting a third, fourth quarter slowdown.
You're seeing the inflation impacts.
Well, the inflationary, you know, that issue continues to be in the headlines. Just today, obviously, the Federal Reserve moved up to a 0.75 again. So we'll see how that navigates, and I trust the Federal Reserve will be able to control a worse scenario. But again, we will see what the spring of 2023 looks like. But I feel very optimistic that things are really moving in the right direction.
Yeah, well, certainly we've peaked, hopefully,
Absolutely.
for all the bad news. All right, Mario, we appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.